A quiet man in the mountains took in a mother and her kids. He didn't know they'd become his world. She knocked only to survive. He opened the door only to be left alone. But in that moment, beneath a sky split open by snow and wind, something else was written. Welcome to real stories that stay, where the quietest choices echo the loudest. If you're someone who believes that family isn't always blood, but sometimes a door creaking open in a storm, then don't forget to subscribe now. Because what happens next isn't just a story. It's a reminder of who we become when no one else is watching. The wind screamed through the forest like it had lost something it could never get back. Snow didn't fall, it attacked sideways, blinding, bitter. Marla Jensen had stopped noticing how cold her hands were hours ago. Her focus was on Jude, Ruby, and Theo, three small shadows in the dark, each step heavier than the last. They didn't cry anymore. Not even Theo. There wasn't energy for that. Just movement. Just survival. She hadn't planned to end up here. But when Clay left them at Red Hollow with a dead truck and a broken promise, this was all that was left. 3 days of walking, a threadbare shawl, half a can of beans, and the whisper of a light in the trees. She saw it when she nearly collapsed, faint, flickering. A cabin. Someone was inside. She couldn't feel her knees anymore as she reached the porch. She didn't remember knocking, but she must have, because the door opened. He was tall, built like someone who worked with his hands, not people. Snow clung to the edge of his boots. Firelight framed him in shadows and edges. He didn't speak, just looked. Marla didn't speak either. Didn't beg. Just let him see the children. Jude standing stiff like he could block the cold for his siblings, Ruby swaying, and Theo barely conscious. For a full breath, nothing moved. Then he stepped aside. Just that. No questions. No welcome. Just space. And it was enough. She pulled him inside. The door slammed behind them like a verdict. Heat hit her face. Fire crackled. Pine smoke. The smell of not dying. He moved quickly but quietly. Chairs scraped forward. Blankets appeared. A tin kettle boiled. Sit was all he said. So she did. The kids, too cold to resist, collapsed near the hearth. He handed her a cup. Huh. Rough clay. No explanations. Just warmth. His name was Eli McCrae. She wouldn't learn that until later. For now, he was just a man who hadn't shut the door. For now, that made all the difference. Marla didn't unpack. Not really. She kept their bag near the door and their boots lined up like soldiers on alert. Every night, after the kids fell asleep near the hearth, she sat by the window, watching the dark trees as if Clay might appear out of them. Eli didn't ask her to stay. He didn't ask her anything at all. He just made space. In the mornings, he left early to chop wood or check the snare lines. By the time she stirred, the kettle was already warm. Jude started following him first. No words, just trailing behind with quiet, stubborn steps. Eli handed him an axe without fanfare, showed him once how to split a log, then walked away. The next day, Jude did it better. By day 3, he was cutting clean. Ruby spent most of her time near the window, braiding pine needles, humming nonsense songs to Theo. But on the 4th day, she named him. Uncle Tree, she said aloud. No warning, no permission. Eli paused, eyes flicking toward her, then returned to the stew pot without a word. Ruby smiled like she'd won. Theo was different. He never let go. Wherever Eli went, a 5-year-old shadow clung to the edge of his coat. At first, Eli kept trying to move away, gently setting him aside. But the boy returned each time like gravity. Eventually, Eli just let him hang on. Marla watched it all from a distance. Not mistrustful, just uncertain. This wasn't supposed to happen. They were supposed to rest, recover, and move on. But the lines between temporary and permanent were blurring. It was around the fire one night when she finally spoke. Eli had just poured water into 3 mugs and sat down across from her. The kids were asleep. Ruby's head on Jude's shoulder. Theo curled into a ball near the quilt line. He left us, she said simply. Eli didn't move. Told me he was getting fuel. Took the keys. Took the money. Didn't come back. She didn't look for pity, and he didn't offer it. Just nodded once. She kept going. Said I'd figure it out. I always do. But this time I couldn't. Not really. I just kept walking. Her voice cracked, but she didn't cry. She was tired of crying. Eli stared into the fire like it had answers. "You got them here," he said eventually. "You didn't stop. That was all. No questions. No judgment. Just the truth." The next morning, she caught him whittling a piece of wood into something small and curved. Theo said it looked like a bear. Ruby insisted it was a cat. Eli didn't say, but he handed it to Jude, who held it like it meant something. By the end of that week, Marla stopped keeping their boots by the door. She moved the bag into the corner, and for the first time in weeks, she slept without waking up to check the window. It happened just after noon, when the sun was high enough to cast shadows across the snow, but not enough to melt any of it. Marla was inside, peeling potatoes. The kids gathered around the table, drawing with bits of charcoal. Eli was in the barn, checking on the old water trough. He heard at first hoofbeats. Slow, deliberate, not a rush, a warning. By the time he stepped outside, 3 men were already coming up the ridge. The one in front wore a black coat too clean for this part of the country, with gloves he didn't need and a look that didn't match the terrain. Clay Jensen hadn't aged a day in swagger, but the cold had thinned the charm on his smile. Behind him, Sheriff Harlan Dobbs rode stiffly, eyes narrowed, one hand resting on a folded paper. Eli didn't move, just waited. Clay dismounted like he owned the land under his boots. "Afternoon," he said, loud enough for anyone nearby to hear. "Heard you've been keeping something that doesn't belong to you." Eli didn't answer. Clay's gaze shifted, resting on the cabin door. Marla stepped out before he could say her name, her apron still in hand. Her face drained. Clay tipped his hat. "Marla," he drawled, "been a long road finding you." The kids stayed inside, but she could feel their eyes at the window. She straightened. "What are you doing here?" "Came to reclaim what's mine," he said, nodding to the sheriff. "By blood. By law." Sheriff Dobbs cleared his throat and unfolded the paper, reading without emotion. "Marla Jensen, under the ruling of County Court Number 42C, legal custody of minors Jude, Ruby, and Theodore Jensen is hereby granted to their father, Clay Jensen. Failure to comply may result in legal consequences." His voice was flat. Clay smiled wider. "Don't make this ugly," he added. "Just hand them over. You've had your little detour." Eli stepped forward, placing himself between the cabin and the men. His voice was low but solid. "This is not your home anymore." Clay turned to him, eyes narrowing. "And who the hell are you?" "The man who didn't leave them in the middle of winter," Eli replied. "The man who didn't make them beg for help." "They're mine," Clay snapped. "By law. And yet, they're not asking for you," Eli said. "They're afraid of you." "That's not your call," Clay growled. "It's the court's." Eli didn't flinch. "Then go back and tell the court what you saw. Tell them they were safe, warm, and wanted. Tell them who came riding in like a king and who stayed through the storm." Clay's mouth twisted. "I'll be back tomorrow," he said, turning to Marla. "You can say goodbye tonight. But come morning, they're leaving with me." He turned, mounted, and rode off, the sheriff following without another word. When the sound of hoofbeats faded, Eli didn't move. Marla stood frozen. Inside, the children had heard everything, and the silence in the cabin now felt heavier than any snowfall. Clay came back the next morning, just like he said he would, only this time with more riders. For men on horseback, coats drawn tight, boots clean enough to show they didn't come from around here. He dismounted with a grin already plastered on his face, like he'd won before the fight began. Sheriff Dobbs followed, slower this time, the court papers folded in one hand, the weight of them suddenly harder to carry. Eli stood on the porch, arms crossed, jaw set. Marla was behind him, standing in the doorway, the children close but silent. Clay looked at the scene and laughed. "You?" he scoffed. "The mountain hermit playing husband now? Real noble." He stepped forward, voice rising. "I've got legal custody. I've got the sheriff. Let's not make this harder than it has to be." Eli didn't answer. Marla didn't move. For a beat, it felt like the ridge itself was holding its breath. Then one voice broke through. She raised those kids when no one else would. Mrs. Ellery, the store owner, stepped out from behind a tree line, bundled in wool and resolve. Fed them, clothed them, kept them alive when the law forgot they existed. Next came Pastor John, walking slow, but with purpose, I baptized Ruby 2 years ago, he said, and I watched her cry herself to sleep the first night she came into town. Don't talk to me about rights you didn't earn. Doc Myers joined them, followed by Frank for the hardware store, then more. One by one, townsfolk appeared, not loud, not armed, just present. Clay turned in a full circle, the smirk draining from his face. This is none of your business, he snapped. They're my kids. They were, Doc said calmly, until you made them someone else's burden. Now, they're someone else's blessing. Clay looked to the sheriff. Well, he asked, aren't you going to enforce this? Dobbs stared down at the papers, then looked at the crowd, then at Marla. The law may be with you, he said slowly, but we're not. Clay's mouth opened, closed, opened again. You think this is over? He hissed. You think a bunch of store clerks and farmers can stand between me and my blood? Eli stepped off the porch. I think they already did. Clay didn't respond. He looked at the sheriff, then at the people, then at Marla. Whatever power he thought he had didn't make it down that mountain. And for the first time since he showed up, Clay Jensen had no one behind him. Clay didn't come back. Not that week, not the next. The trail he left behind hardened and faded, just another mark swallowed by thawing ground. Whatever hold he had on the kids, on Marla, on the law was gone. And with him, something else left too. The edge, the tightness in Marla's shoulders, the hesitation in the kid's eyes. It didn't disappear all at once. It unraveled slowly, quietly, in the kind of ways people don't notice until one day the silence isn't heavy anymore, it's just calm. Jude spent his mornings with Eli, no longer needing permission. Eli didn't talk much, but he showed the boy how to check the angle of the blade, how to find the weak point in a log, how to strike without wasting effort. Jude didn't ask questions. He listened, and when he made mistakes, Eli didn't correct him with words. He just handed him another log. Ruby took to writing with the same stubbornness. She practiced her letters in straight rows on butcher paper Marla found in a drawer. She asked how to spell words like home and safe, and once when she thought no one was looking, she wrote McCrae 3 times and folded it into her pocket. Theo didn't cling anymore. He still stayed close to Eli, but now it was by choice, not fear. He ran, shouted, hid behind trees, then jumped out laughing like he invented joy himself. He sang nonsense songs, made up rules for games only he understood, and laughed in full, unfiltered bursts that filled the cabin like sunlight through cracked windows. Marla watched it all from the table one afternoon, her hands resting idle on a dish towel. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. The walls held the words for her. Eli noticed. He didn't say anything either, but later that night, after the kids were asleep, she caught him standing just outside the cabin door, eyes closed, listening. What? She asked, stepping beside him. He didn't open his eyes. I forgot what it sounded like, he said quietly. What did? Laughter, he said. Inside. Not mine. Not memories. Real. She didn't touch him, just stood close enough that he'd know she was there. And for a long minute, they just stood like that. Two people who knew what it meant to go without finally standing in a place that didn't need fixing, just living. The snow melted slower than expected, but it melted. Patches of brown earth reappeared beneath the trees, and the creek behind the cabin began to move again. Marla watched it each morning with her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, as if waiting for the thaw to carry her decision with it. She hadn't said it out loud. Not yet, but everyone felt it. The bag was back by the door. The map was unfolded on the table. The kids didn't ask. Jude got quieter. Ruby stopped practicing her cursive. Theo clung a little more, but not in fear, just in confusion. Eli said nothing. He didn't try to stop her. He never had. That night, the one before she was supposed to leave, she couldn't sleep. The children were out cold, worn from a day in the woods, but she stayed up near the hearth, watching the fire drop to embers. Eli was at the table, working a dull blade against wood with the same steady rhythm he always did when his hands needed to be busy, but his thoughts didn't. Marla didn't look at him when she asked, "What if we stayed?" The question landed without force, soft but full. He paused, not dramatically, not to make a point, just because he wasn't expecting it. He set the carving down. "I hear this place differently when you're here," he said. That was it. No grand declaration. No promises. Just truth. She nodded, once, as if confirming something she'd already decided before she said it out loud. Then she crossed the room. Not fast, not slow, just certain. He stood when she reached him. They didn't kiss. Not right away. She pressed her forehead to his chest. His arms came around her like they'd always known how. There was no hunger in it, no rush. Just gravity. Just a choice made by two people who had been left behind and, somehow, found something worth staying for. Clay returned without warning. No sheriff. No good documents. Just him on a tired horse, clothes dusted with travel, not power. He didn't ride him like a man reclaiming something. He rode like someone hoping for a reason to stop. Eli met him at the edge of the yard, no weapon in hand, just waiting. Marla stood in the doorway, the kids beside her. Clay dismounted, boots sinking without the usual snap in his step. No smile this time. No speech. He looked at Jude, at Ruby, at Theo. His blood, but no longer his. Jude spoke first. "You're not our dad," he said, not angry, just clear. Ruby took Jude's hand. Theo didn't hide. Marla didn't step back. "You left us for dead," she said. "He kept us alive." Clay blinked, like the words hit harder than he expected. He didn't argue, didn't explain. He looked at Eli, nodded once, maybe in defeat, maybe in thanks it didn't matter. Then he turned, climbed back on the horse, and left. This time, for good. No threat, no fire, just silence behind him. That night, after dinner and baths, and the slow quiet of safety returned, Theo climbed into Eli's lap with something tight behind his eyes. "Can I call you Dad now?" he whispered. Eli didn't answer right away. He pulled the boy in, held him like the world might fall if he let go. His voice cracked when he said, "Yeah, buddy, you can." Jude looked up from his book. Ruby smiled without saying a word. Marla stood in the doorway, watching all of it with her arms folded and a smile that didn't ask for more. Eli didn't say it aloud, but for the first time, the word home didn't feel like a place he lost. It felt like something he was building, one voice, one choice, one child at a time. If this story moved you, if it reminded you that family isn't who we're born to, it's who stays, who chooses us, who shows up even when they're scared, then leave us a comment below. Tell us who your Eli is. And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because here, we don't just tell stories. We remember what they mean.